Hey, it's Jake, and today I'm going to show you how to make this simple head rig using Duik Bassel connectors. Let's get started. This is the character I'm going to be making a head rig for. His name is Red, and he doesn't have a head rig right now. This is just a standard layer, flat, no controls built into it. So let's actually jump over to Illustrator, and this is the artwork that we're going to be using to build the head rig. Now, if you want to use this artwork, I'm making it available in the description. Just check there for the link, and you can download this head to follow along with the tutorial. But if you're going to use your own artwork, I want to walk through how I set up this document so you know what you need to do. And this works for both Illustrator and Photoshop designs. You need to make sure that every piece of your character's head that needs to move is on its own layer. So if you take a look over here in my layer stack, there's a lot in here. And if you're in Illustrator and you're not used to layers, make sure that you understand that a layer is different than the contents of a layer. So some of these layers have multiple objects in them. These are not separate layers. They're paths within a group within a layer. So they have to be in their own layers if they're going to come into After Effects separately, and that's what we need. So make sure that you're making new layers down here and labeling each one clearly. It's very important to stay organized so you can easily identify what every layer is just by looking at the name. So let's walk through this really quickly. I've got my hair top layer, so that's this up here, right and left ears, and I labeled those with the character's left and right. So this is technically the character's left ear. It's from their perspective. Then we've got the hair base, and this is the first layer that I kind of want to focus on for a second because this is made up of a couple of different layers. If we go into this and look at the paths, I have a compound shape made up of two different paths. And I'm actually just going to take these paths out of that compound shape for a second so you can see what's happening. So if I move this shape down, we've got this part of the hair, which represents basically the part that sticks on the head. And then I have this path, which is basically the hairline. And it looks a little bit weird, but let me show you how it works. If I select both of them and make it a compound shape again by holding down Option or Alt and clicking on the minus front option in Pathfinder, that's going to use the front path as kind of like a cookie cutter, punching a hole into the path behind it. And if I double click on this so that I can move it around, as I do this, you see that the shape up top that's being styled and filled is adjusting. So I can use this to give the hair some movement as we rotate the head back and forth. And you see that Illustrator is basically treating this as if the final path, the result of this Pathfinder operation, is what's getting styled. And that's going to really look nice once we go to rig this in After Effects. But as I do this, you see that I kind of turned his head to his left. We've got this gap behind the hair, so we need to modify the head in order to fill that out. So let me just undo back to the neutral state. There we go. And I just want to take that head shape, which is right here at the bottom, and I'm going to lock my hair base just so I can't click on it. But I want to make this shape, instead of it just going right here, kind of fill out the hair shape up top. And we might need to adjust this once we go to rig it, but I can already tell we're going to need that extra space. So I'm going to do that right now using this tool right here, the anchor point tool underneath the pen tool. And then I'll just click and drag on this anchor and kind of widen this out. And I'm going to hold shift so it locks it to the X axis. And just push that out a little bit, and then change the shape of the head just a little bit, just so it lines up a little more nicely here. And maybe I'll pull this out so I don't have to bend it quite as much. I don't want to mess with the bottom half, the jawline, too much, but this is going to help hide the artwork the way that it was built once we go to rig it. So now it's shaped a little bit more closely to the hair. So try and do that with your own character if you can do that. I'm going to push this point up too, and just make sure it's not poking out from behind the hair. I'm going to scale this point just by selecting it with my direct selection tool, pressing S for the scale tool, and then clicking and dragging to scale those handles in symmetrically. There we go. Now that path isn't poking out from behind the hair, and I think that'll work. Okay, I'll turn the other layers back on, unlock that hair base, and next we've got the nose, the left and right eyes, the freckles, and I left all of those as one layer because I'm not going to need to move those individually. Those are always going to move as a group, whereas the eyes and the eyebrows, those can move independently. You know, maybe I want the character to go cross-eyed, and maybe I want to raise one eyebrow higher than the other. So I need those layers to be separate so I can move them independently. Freckles don't need to move independently. They're on one layer. Then I've got the mouth, and I named this Rest because I actually have a lot of different mouth shapes. So I can go down through this to cycle through all these different mouth phonemes, the different mouth shapes, to make up all of these different sounds that come out when you're talking. So I've got all these different mouth shapes, and I'm not gonna show you how I made these. That is an entirely different topic and a lot to learn. And I'll actually tell you where I learned it. Fraser Davidson of Cub Studio has a great Skillshare class on character lip sync. So I'll put a link to that in the description of this video as well if you want to go learn more about mouth shapes and lip sync. But I will be showing you how I rig this up using Duik. So those are all my mouth shapes, and then we've got the head layer. So that's all that makes up this head. And the next thing I want to talk about is basically the range that you want to be able to give your character. Now, for this particular rig, I'm going to try to make a head that can look all the way to the character's left, all the way to the character's right, and really get a lot of range out of it. But generally, that's pretty difficult to do unless your character design really supports it. More often than not, you're probably going to want to just give a little bit of movement to a specific head pose and then do a separate head pose with a different rig for a different direction. So maybe we have a front-facing rig, which is this one, and he can look a little bit this way and that way, move his head up and down a bit, but you need to modify the design of some of these layers for something that's turning all the way to the side or at more of a 3/4 pose. It really depends on your character design, and like I said, I'm gonna try and put as much range of motion into this head rig as I possibly can. But let me just jump over to After Effects really quick and show you the entire rig. This is the flat artwork. There's no rigging going on in this head, and you see that I kind of designed him in this 3/4 pose, so he's looking off to the side. So with the artwork that I have here, I'm gonna try and build a rig that will give me at least this much range, so I can push the head all the way to this pose from this front-facing pose and still have it look good. And obviously I'll do the same thing for the opposite direction. We'll see if we can make that happen. Okay, let's get this into After Effects. The only thing I need to do is first break up this compound shape because that is not gonna come into After Effects the way that I need it to. So I'm just gonna go into the compound shape, select both paths, and drag them out. So those two paths are on the same layer, but that's okay. We're going to recreate that same kind of Pathfinder operation inside of After Effects using shape layers. So I'm gonna save this and then jump into After Effects and bring in the artwork. So I'm gonna right click, go into Import, File. There's the head artwork, I'll import that. Make sure it's importing as a composition with the footage dimensions being the layer size, not the document size. Same thing for Photoshop. If you're bringing in Photoshop artwork, make sure you're importing as a composition and retaining layer sizes. I'll click OK. And then just rename this Red Head Rig. That way it's nice and organized, and I've got the actual layers for that artwork right here. I'm just gonna move that to my assets folder, and then double click into that head rig. And here are all the exact same layers, labeled the same way I had them in Illustrator, all organized nice and ready to go. Now obviously we're gonna be using Duik Bassel to rig this head. If you don't already have it installed, check the link in the description to find the download. That'll bring you to this page. Just scroll down to find the Windows or Mac version, depending on your operating system. And right here are the instructions on how to install it. You're gonna need to restart After Effects if it's already open once you've installed it, but it's a very simple process. Once that's done, get into After Effects and go up to Window, Duik Bassel to open it up. And it's probably gonna come undocked, which will look like this. So what you need to do to get it docked is just click and drag right here on the name and then hover over a different panel to dock it into it. Now, I wanna put it below this project panel, so I'm gonna click and drag right here and let go. That way it puts it in this column below my project panel. And this is a great time to talk about my actual workspace. This probably looks a little different than your workspace. When you're doing character rigging and animation, you need to be able to have as much visibility of your layers panel as possible because there's so many different layers you're gonna be keyframing and you want easy access to them. So this is a panel setup that I suggest you mimic. And let me actually just show you how to recreate it. First of all, these are my workspaces up here. If you're not familiar, you can make custom workspaces. So I'm just gonna click on my default workspace right there and it snaps to what I typically work with. But I can modify this. So I don't need the align panel for rigging. So I'm gonna right click on it and say close panel. I'm gonna right click on motion 2, close that. Preview I don't need. None of the type panels are necessary. I don't even need the effects and presets. Over here I have Duik, GIF gun. I don't need anything but Duik in this section. And these are the panels that I want, but they're not arranged the way that I want them. Actually, let me get rid of the render queue. But to rearrange these panels, I can just click and drag on any of them. So that undocked my composition right there. I want this on the far right side. So I'm gonna move it over here until I get that green bar all the way up and down on the right side of my screen and let go. Now that's on the right side and it's docked there. No other panels are in this column now, and that gives me lots of space to see what I'm working on. Next, I want the layers on the left side. So I'm gonna click and drag this and move it over to the left side with that green bar. That's gonna dock my layers, or at least that layers panel right there, but I still have this one right here. So I'm gonna drag this over top of this panel, not at the top of it, but right on top in the middle. We get this big square overlay, and I'll let go. So there, my composition layers live on the left side now. And I'm left with my project panel, my effects controls, and Duik. And that's exactly how I want this set up. So I'm just gonna come down here and change my zoom to 100%. And now everything's set up again. Now, this is still active as my Jake's default panel group, but I can save this as a new panel layout if I just click on this little menu and say save as new workspace. And then I can name this whatever I want. Now, I already have a character rigging set up, so I'm just gonna click on that, and it remembers what I had. One more quick tip, if I click on Jake's, it's gonna remember however I had it set up last, or if I click on this menu and say reset to saved layout, it'll go back to the last time I saved it, which you can do at any point right here, save changes to this workspace. All right, so that's how workspaces work if you're not familiar, but I'm going back to my character rigging workspace and we can start rigging. So if you just installed Duik for the first time, you're probably not using the right user interface. So if yours doesn't look like mine, or if you're not sure if it looks like mine, come over to this little settings wrench icon. And down here under user interface, make sure that you are on the standard layout, not rookie. Rookie is not going to give you all of the controls that you need, and expert is going to give you everything but without labels. So just stay on the standard version. That's the version I work on. That's what you want. Click apply changes. It'll refresh, and then you can go back to the rigging tab. Okay, let's start rigging up the head. This is the section that we want to be on, links and constraints. We don't need any structures for the head, at least not this design, but we are going to need connectors, and this is what's basically going to drive the entire head rig. So let's talk about what connectors are. I'm going to click on this and kind of walk you through what this whole system is. Connectors basically allow you to tie any one property or multiple properties to another property, kind of like parenting, but you get to determine how much influence one property has over the other. It's going to make a lot more sense if I just give you an example. So let's start by looking at what we have access to. First of all, we need to make a controller or pick a master property. So that's what this step 1 is telling us to do. And it's important to point out that you don't have to use the built-in controllers that Duik will give you. We are going to, but you could do this with any property. And one of the best ways of explaining that is this example from the creator of Duik, which is like a bicep here that is being flexed as the arm bends. So you could actually keyframe the path for the shape of this bicep and then tie it to the rotation of this elbow so that when it bends, the muscle flexes. So even though we're rigging ahead with this, don't limit the connector's possibilities. You can use it for all sorts of things, being able to drive certain animations using other controls. And to do that, you would just select whatever property you want to be the master and then click on Pick Master Property. That loads it up and then you'd move on to the next step. Like I said, we're not going to do that. We're going to be using these controllers. So let's just go ahead and walk through what they are. The first one is a slider. If I click on this, it's going to generate the slider and I can move this over here and we've got a handle in the middle. I'm going to make this a little bit easier to see just by changing my composition settings and changing this background color to 50% black or gray. And then turn off the transparency. There we go. Now we can see that a little bit easier. But this doesn't do anything on its own. It just gives you this one-dimensional slider with a handle that allows you to then tie properties to it. Okay, I don't need that right now. I'm going to delete it. The next option is a 2D slider. I'm probably going to accidentally refer to this as a joystick. So if I say joystick, I'm talking about the 2D slider. But this is the same thing. It's a controller with a handle in the middle that allows you to move on both the X and Y axes. We're going to be using a lot of these. Let me delete that. And the last option is an angle controller. And this is really a lot like the angle control within the expression controls right here. So under expression controls, angle control, it's just a visual version of it. So you just switch to the rotation of that and rotate it to get a value. We're probably not going to need that for this rig. All right, so let's delete that. And I'm going to generate the 2D controller one more time, 2D slider, and just point out that it does generate two layers. We've got the background layer and the actual handle. So CBG stands for controller background and C for controller. Now, when I generated that, it automatically filled in the information for the next step, which is set values. We have controls for the axis, so either X or Y. We have to set each one individually. Then we have the type, which is value or velocity. We're going to be working with values. And then you have the value ranges. So the minimum is set to -100 and maximum to 100. So you can kind of think of that as -100% to 100%. Okay, so since that's loaded up as the master control, we then need to select some children to connect to that controller. So I'm just going to use the head layer as an example. I'm going to turn all the other layers off, and we're just going to start with this for a second so you can see what's going to happen. I'm going to open up the position of that property, and I'm going to set a keyframe right at the beginning. So I'll just click once on the position keyframe, and then I'm going to move forward one frame, page down on the keyboard, set another keyframe, then move forward one more frame and set one more. So I have 3 keyframes. They're all identical. And if I zoom in here nice and close so you can see the space between these points, I want you to kind of compare the distance between these dots to the distance between the edges of this controller background and the controller handle itself. Think of this middle keyframe as the center position of this controller, the left keyframe as the left side of the joystick, and the right keyframe as the right side of the joystick. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, I want to go to the first keyframe, which represents this side of the joystick, remember, and I'm just going to move it over to the left, okay? And then I'm going to go to the third keyframe, which represents this side, and I'm going to move it over to the right. Now, if I just page up and down, you see that that isn't a nice animation or anything, but it's just 3 different keyframe properties. Well, if I go to the next step, which is select children, and actually click on the position property, then say connect to properties, that is going to add an expression on the position property tying its values to this controller handle. So watch what happens when I move this to the left. Okay, and if I move it to the right. So can you see what's happening? I just tied this property to the x-axis of this controller based on these 3 keyframes, which again, the middle keyframe you can think of as kind of the middle of the joystick, the left keyframe as the left side, and the right keyframe as the right side. These keyframes are now kind of disregarded in terms of animation, and they're just reading as values for Duik to tie to this controller. This is the basis of how we're going to work with this head rig. Now, you'll notice nothing is happening when I move this on the y-axis because we haven't tied anything to the y-axis yet. Now, in order to get the position to move on the y-axis with this controller, I actually need to separate the dimensions. So let me undo back before I added that expression, right-click on the position and say separate dimensions. Now I have keyframes for all these properties, and for whatever reason we have easing shapes on them, so I'm just going to select them, hold down Command or Control and click. And if I page up and down, you'll notice the X position is the only one that's changing, which makes sense. I only moved it left and right. But now let's go to the first frame and move it up as well. So I'm going to move it up. Then I'm going to go down to this third keyframe, move it down. And then I'll tie these properties to the controller again. So I'm going to select that X position. We're still on the X axis and say connect to properties. Now left and right works again, but up and down still doesn't. But if I change this axis from X to Y, Duik updates, I can now select the Y position, say connect to properties. And now if I move it up and down, it's going to move to those keyframe values. So the position is now being driven by this joystick or this 2D slider control. What's interesting about this is that you can adjust these keyframes after you've rigged this up and it will still be responsive. So if I were to select this controller and open up the effects, we have a 2D value connector and 2D value connector 2. So these are really the X and Y controls. And if I turn each of them off, just disable them for a second, it goes back to my keyframe values. It's no longer tying them to those values, which allows me to see what I set my keyframes at, regardless of what this controller is doing. So you see it's not moving it anymore. So let's say on the left side, I don't like how far up it moves. I could just drag it down a little bit and then move it over to the third keyframe and move it up a little bit, and then just re-enable these effects, and the controller is back to being responsive again. Okay, so it doesn't move as much up and down as it does left and right. Another interesting thing is if I zoom out a little bit, I could space these keyframes out. So I'm going to go to the first frame, hold down Shift and press page down to jump 10 frames forward, and then move the second two set of keyframes to that point, move 10 more frames, zoom out a little again, grab the last set of keyframes and move them here, and now it's going to be exactly the same as what I had before. There's just more distance between each keyframe. Now, I like to actually work like this where my keyframes between poses are set up 10 frames apart because it's just easier to see. I don't have to be so far zoomed in, but it also allows us to do some interesting things. Like say if I wanted to go halfway between this middle set of keyframes, which is the center 0 value of this 2D controller, then going right in between these two keyframes would be halfway between here and here. So what I can do is now add in more keyframes right here. So I'm going to disable these effects one more time and then just move this over here just for fun. And that's going to add new keyframes here. I'll re-enable this. And now watch what happens. You can see this motion trail, but watch what happens when I move this to the left. Once it gets to halfway between the middle and the left side, it's going to this set of keyframes, the values at that set of keyframes before going to this set. So I know it's kind of a unique way of thinking about keyframes, but if you spread them out evenly, you can literally imagine them being mapped to positions on this box right here. And it allows you to do some very interesting things. Another really cool thing is that easing actually influences how this works as well. So if I select these two keyframes, ease it, and then go into my graph editor and just select these keyframes, I can turn off these controls right here, but I'll just increase the easing a lot into that keyframe, incoming and outgoing on that pose. Now if I just move this over, see that it gets to that pose really quickly and then snaps to this pose. So the easing of your keyframe actually makes a difference on how Duik is mapping those values to the controller. All right, so let me go back to this neutral state, and I'm going to get rid of my keyframes at that point. I'll get rid of these two sliders and then remove the expressions from these properties by holding down Option or Alt, Shift, and the plus key on the keyboard. That removes those expressions, and I'll turn on all my other layers, leaving off all the different mouth shapes. We'll do that probably last. But here I am with my original artwork, and now that we know how all this works, we can actually start rigging things. So the first thing that you should think about before you start tying properties to these controllers is that this is all being done with expressions. And the more expressions you have, the slower After Effects is going to run. So you're going to want to minimize as much as you can by parenting as many layers as possible to controllers. So a great example of this is basically the facial features. The mouth, the freckles, the eyes, the eyebrows, they're all going to move the same distance when the head turns. The nose is going to move with those objects, but probably move more so than the rest. So we're going to need some extra controls for that. But to start out, let's grab everything on the face, including the nose, and parent that to a null. So let me just make that null first. Go up to Layer, New, Null Object, and I'll rename this Facial Features. And I'm just going to redo the anchor point to be 50-50 so that it's centered up around that face a little bit better. And then move it down to just above the nose. Then I'll select the nose, the eyes, the freckles, and the eyebrows, as well as all of the mouth shapes, even though they're not on. And I'm going to parent those all to the facial features. If you don't see this parent and link column, just right-click on the columns up here, make sure parent and link is visible or checked. Okay, so all those are parented to the null. When the null moves, everything on the face moves with it. I'm not worried about the ears or the hair quite yet. Let's just start with that face. So I'm going to open up the position, P on the keyboard, and separate the dimensions. So I have access to both the X and Y position values. And you'll notice they're both at 400 by 400, and that's because my comp is 800 by 800, and it's at the center. I actually want to zero this value out. So I'm going to hit cancel here and go to another command that Duik gives us right here. I'm going to select that layer and then click on 0. And what that does is makes a null in the exact same position as my selection, parents this layer to that null, then hides, shies, and locks that layer so I can't even see it anymore. If I unshy all of my layers, there it is down at the bottom. But because it's parenting it to a layer that's in the exact same spot, the relative position of the child to the parent is now 0, 0. So now I can easily know how far off of the center I'm moving the face on the X and Y axes. And that's just gonna make everything a lot cleaner. Okay, with that done, I'm gonna set a keyframe on the X position. We're just gonna focus on X for now at 10 frames. Remember, that is kind of where I want the central 0 value of the slider to be represented at that 10th frame. And then I'm gonna make a connector. I need to make sure that nothing is selected. So let's go into connector, and then I'll create a controller. And I'm gonna make sure nothing is selected first, and click on the 2D controller button. All right, so that generates the sliders. I'm gonna rename this head control. I'll do the same thing for the actual controller. And then I'll just move that off of the head. It does not matter where I put this right now. We're probably gonna be rearranging these in a little bit once everything is rigged up. But I'll just move it off to the bottom for now. Then I wanna grab that null controller, find that X position, and back it up to the first frame. Remember, this is going to be the left position of this controller, so I wanna move it over as far as I possibly can. So I'm gonna turn off the hair and the ears for now. It's gonna look a little bit weird, but just so I can kind of see how far I'm pushing this. If we take a look at the actual rig, you see that the eye kind of overlaps the side of the head, the eyebrow goes off, the nose goes really far off. So I'm gonna try and get close to that, somewhere around here. Obviously the freckles are going off of the head, so that's not really gonna work out. To fix that, I'm just gonna duplicate the head, move it up above the freckles, and set this to an alpha matte. I need to toggle my switches and modes so I can see the alpha matte option. Click, and now those freckles are gonna stay within the head. Now they're still going over that stroke, which I don't really like, so I'm just gonna quickly add an effect matte simple choker so I can just choke that matte a little bit and bring it into the inside of that stroke. There we go. That looks good. And I'm just gonna rename this head matte. Okay, so that's my left position on the X-axis, which went -57 pixels. So I'm just gonna round that up to -60 and call that good. Obviously the nose is not where it should be, but like I said, we're gonna get to that in a second. So let's just instead go forward 10 frames and 10 more frames to the third position and go 60 pixels in the opposite direction. Most of the time you wanna stay symmetrical when you're doing something like a head turn because you want the head to be able to turn the same amount in each direction. So that's why the symmetrical values off of the 0 position is so helpful. Okay, so that's gonna be my left and right turn. Now let's take a look at the nose. I wanna be able to push that a little bit further in each direction, so let me open up the position for that, separate the dimensions, and those values need to be 0 as well. So I'm gonna select that layer, hit cancel, click on 0, and then go back into connector. And I need to now load this back up because I exited out of it. It doesn't have this controller anymore. So I'm just gonna select that handle and say pick master property, and that will load it back up. Then I'll set an X position keyframe at that 0 position, go to the left, and then push this out as far as I need to. So somewhere around there is probably good. Maybe just a little bit further, and I'll round that to -30. So that's now gonna go 30 pixels further than the rest of the face. And you can see that actually does add a little bit of depth, making it look like his nose is coming off the front of his face, which is nice. We'll go to the third pose and push that out 30 pixels in the opposite direction. And now that those keyframes are set, I can select them and say connect to properties, and that's now being driven by this joystick, which is great. That's exactly what I wanted. Now, I don't need to see that facial features null anymore, so I'm just gonna disable it, just so it's a little bit cleaner. But I'd say that's a great start to this head turn. And I'm gonna come back and do the Y-axis after I've set the X-axis up for everything that needs it. Okay, I just took a break for a second and came back because I noticed there was a little bit of a glitch. After Effects didn't recognize the updates I made to the Illustrator file. Remember when we changed the head shape? So that's why the head looks a little bit different now, but the rig is still the same. So I just updated the artwork, reloaded that, and let's move on to the hair base now. So I'm gonna turn that layer on, and remember, this is something that we need to use shape operators in order to get to work the way that it should. So I'm gonna turn this into a shape layer by right-clicking, going down to Create, and say Create Shapes from Vector Layer. Okay, I don't actually really even need this hair base Illustrator layer in here anymore, so I'm just gonna delete it and rename the shape layer as just hair base. And inside the contents of this shape layer, I have two groups, one for each path, but there's also a fill and a stroke for each path, and I don't need two fills and strokes, so I'm just gonna grab the second path, move it into the first group, and delete the second group. All right, so by default, these two paths are already interacting, but not in the way that they should be. So this first path is the hairline. So I'm going to rename that hairline path. And the second one is kind of the bounds. So I'm going to name that bounds path. And that way I can identify them a little bit more easily. What I need is to add a merge paths operator so that I can basically do the exact same thing the Pathfinder was in Illustrator. If I open this up, it's defaulted to add, so it's just merging those two shapes. But if I change this to subtract, it's not working. And that's just because of the order of the paths. Whatever's underneath is going to subtract from whatever's on top. So I need the hairline to subtract from the bounds, not the other way around. So I'm just going to rearrange these two, and there we go. We've recreated that exact same shape. The great thing about this is now I can grab this path and then move it left and right as that head rotates. However, I can only keyframe the path, and I want to be able to control this with a position property. To do that, all I have to do is group this path. So with it selected, I'll press Command G or Control G on a PC, and that shifts it down and to the right, which is annoying, but all I have to do is go into the group, go into the transform group, and change the position back down to 0, 0. And there we go, it's back to where it should be. You can collapse that group, and I'll rename this one more time, hairline. But now with those group controls, I can move this path using the position property of the group rather than the actual path, which will make things easier. Unfortunately, I can't separate these dimensions, so I need to actually link this to a null that I can separate the dimensions of. So I'm just going to grab the facial features null and duplicate it, and I'll rename this hair base control. And I'll move that right above the hair base layer. Okay, now this has the expression already tied to the exposition, so I need to get rid of that. Hold down Option or Alt. I'll hold down Option or Alt, Shift, and the plus key to remove that expression. And then go to the neutral pose right there. And then actually just get rid of the keyframes and set it down to 0. I'll turn that on so we can see it. And because it's already zeroed out based on the facial features null, I don't have to zero this out. We've already got those values, so that's great. Now, to tie this to the X and Y position, which are already separated, I need to write a little expression. So let me open this up so I have more room. I'll hold down Option or Alt and click on that stopwatch to start my expression, and I need to write two variables. So a variable is just text that I'm using basically as shorthand to reference a longer code. So I'm going to start by typing VAR for variable, and then a space, and then I'll name the first one X. You can name it whatever you want. I need an X and a Y, so I'm going to just name them X and Y, and I'll say another space equals space, and then use this expression pick whip to select the X position of that hair base control. So it's going to link this long line of code to this little variable that I wrote, the X. And I'll finish that off with a semicolon. Let me give myself a lot more room so we can see this all in one line. Then I'll drop down another line and say VAR for variable again, Y equals, and then use that expression pick whip, grab the Y position, and then semicolon to finish off that line of code. I'll drop down 2 lines, and this is where I now write my expression referencing those variables. And to link these up, I need to use an array. An array is just multiple values, and they're contained within brackets. So I'm going to press the left square bracket, type X, which remember, this is now referencing this line of code, which references the X position value of my hair base control. So the X position of this value is now going to follow that. I'll do a comma for the second axis, which is the Y axis. Type in Y, which is referencing this Y position right here, and then finish it with a closed square bracket and a semicolon. So now the X and Y values of this position property within this shape layer group are going to mirror what the X and Y values of this hair base control are. So if I move this over, you see that is now adjusting the shape of the hair, which is exactly what I needed. If I move it up or down, left or right, it's going to follow. And something that I'm noticing is that I'm not getting the little curve right here like I had in the artwork. If I recreate this one more time, you see that I should have that little bit of curve behind the ear. So I think that my paths are just slightly misaligned somehow. It should be a little bit higher. If I put this back down to 0, 0, I think this should be just a little bit higher. And that might have something to do with the way that I had to refresh the artwork. But to fix it, I'll just go into the contents, find that bounds path, and then modify it a little bit. So this path right here is kind of cutting it off. And I want to modify this path so that it actually comes down a lot further, because this whole shape down here is kind of like the back of the head where the hairline would be if this were to move over here. You know, we'd see some hair over here. So let me just grab the path from the bounds and maybe just drag it down a bit, maybe down to say here, and kind of modify the path so that it fits the head a little bit more closely. Let me just shape that here, shape it over here, and I think that's going to work out better. So now when I move this head further around, we get this shape for the back of the head, and we can modify that path to whatever shape we want it to be once we get to that stage. But for now, I think that's going to work. Now I just need to tie that X position to the controller. So right now the face is moving left and right. Now the reality is, if I set this back down to 0, 0, I could just parent this hair-based control to the facial features, and then it would follow that around without needing more expressions. But I can already tell that the face is going to move a lot further than I really want the hair to. So instead of parenting it and then kind of counteracting those movements with more keyframes, I'm just going to use a unique set of keyframes for the hair base. So let's go to frame 10, make sure I'm there, and set a value of 0 for that X position, go to the far left, and then move this as far as I feel like I should. So I'm thinking somewhere around here, which is -39. I'll just make that an even 40, and then go forward to the third pose, set that at 40, and then tie this X position to this controller. So I need to go into the connector, I need to select this controller, pick master property, make sure I'm on the X axis, select that X position, and say connect to properties. So now the hair is moving with the rest of the head. That's great. Okay, let's get the ears turned on. This is going to be a little bit more interesting because we don't want them to just move left and right like this. We don't want the ears to go off the head. Instead, if you think about the shape of your head, it's kind of like a sphere. The ear is going to move this way when the head is looking that way. And then it's going to get to this point and move here. And then when it turns further this way, the ear's not going to go this way. It's going to go back in this way, but it needs to go behind the head. And we're going to need 2 copies of each ear. So let's just start by adding these neutral values. This is where we want them to be when the controller is right in the middle. So I'll go to that point in time, frame 10, open up the position and separate their dimensions and 0 those out. So I'll click on them, exit out of the connector and say 0, and then set an X position keyframe for each of these. Then let's go to the third pose. And again, just focus on this right ear, the character's right ear. This would be when the head is turned all the way to the character's left. So we want the ear to follow basically the hairline, right? So that should be 40 pixels, which it just happened to move at that exact amount freehand, but that's how far the ear should be moving when the head turns that far, because it's important that ear stays with that shape of the hairline. But when we go back in the opposite direction, which would be over here, and I'm holding down Command, by the way, or Control on a PC to snap to that point exactly, the ear is not going 40 pixels this direction. Really, it should go 40 pixels again back the same direction. So let's just change that to 40 one more time. And obviously we can see it. We don't want to be able to see it. But this is where we're going to get a little bit tricky with the way that we're using this controller. So far, we've only used the position property, but we can tie any properties to this controller. So if I press Shift-T, that will add the opacity to the visibility of this layer. And I'm going to set some keyframes for this. So let's go to the center, the 0 value for the controller, and add a keyframe on the opacity. And then we'll go to the third position again. This is where the head is turned to this side. And I'll set another opacity keyframe. I want it to be 100% opacity when this controller is all the way to the right. But then when it's all the way to the left, I want it to be 0% opacity. I don't want to see it at all. So I'm going to turn the opacity all the way down. All right, now let's tie both of these values to this controller. So go into the connector, select that controller and pick master property, loads up the X axis, and then I'll select both the X position and hold down Command or Control and click on the opacity and tie both of those properties to the controller. Now, when I move this, the ear fades up and it stays on when it's on the right side of this controller. So it is working, it's just not working the way that we want it to. But here's where it's really interesting. Remember when I said that the easing values are taken into account with these controllers? Well, I can actually change these opacity keyframes to hold keyframes. If I right click on them and say toggle hold keyframe, and now you see that that ear pops on from 0% opacity to 100%, right there when the controller value goes to 0. So it turns off when we shouldn't see it, and it turns on when we should. Now, we're not done, obviously. We still want to be able to see the ear when it's behind the head. So what I need to do is duplicate this right ear, and I'll call it right ear back. And just to cut down on the expressions, I'm actually going to open up the position, get rid of that expression, Option-Shift+, and I need to make sure that I go to the 0 position value so that it lines up with the right ear in the front. And let me change the controller back down to 0 so we can see it, but there we go. We've got both copies in the exact same position, and then I'll get rid of those X position keyframes and just parent it to the right ear. I'm going to leave the keyframes for the opacity because I still need those, but now I can grab this layer and drag it below the head and modify these opacities. So on the first position, where it's all the way to the left, we're not going to see the ear, but we still want it to be at 100% instead of 0. So I'm going to change that value. And then as I move this, you can see that the ear is visible now up until it switches to the front. And at that point, we don't want it to be visible anymore, the back copy. So I'm going to double click on this second value and change it to 0. Click OK. And now that value is 0 as soon as it crosses over the halfway point. But it just looks like it's passing in front of the head. And then finally, the third keyframe also needs to be down at 0 so that when it's all the way over here, it's still invisible. Okay, so that's how we can get a layer to pass in front of and behind the head. Now let's just do the exact same thing for the other ear. So I'm going to grab that left ear copy, and on the first pose, move it backwards 40 pixels. Remember, that would be right here so that it stays in line with that ear. Then I'll go forward to the third pose and just copy that keyframe over again. Then I'll bring up the opacity, Shift-T, and set a keyframe here for 100% opacity, a keyframe at the beginning for 100% opacity, and a keyframe at the end for 0, which is the opposite of the other ear, which makes sense. So I'm going to select both of those properties now, X position and opacity, and connect them to that controller. And now it's going to fade off as soon as we get past that 0 value. I'll just convert these to hold keyframes, toggle hold keyframe. And actually, I made a mistake there. I want this middle keyframe to be a value of 0, which is different than the right ear. But once it hits that middle frame is where we need the back copy to come in. So I'm going to change that value down to 0. And now everything on the left side is going to be visible and the right side will not be. Okay, so now that that's set, I can duplicate this ear. I'll rename it L ear back and open up the position to get rid of that keyframe, making sure I go to that neutral value first, get rid of the expression, Option-Shift+, get rid of that keyframe. And I need to make sure this controller is at a value of 0, 0 before I parent the left ear back to the left ear. That way they're in the exact same position. I'll move this down to the back just below the right ear, bring up the opacity. So at the center, I want it to be set to 100% opacity. At the left, I want it to be set at 100% opacity. And at the right, I want it to be set at 0% opacity. Now this does bring up an issue, which is that when I have it set to 0, 0, I can't have both ears at the front at the same time. If I move this 1 pixel to the left, the ears swap, and 1 pixel to the right, there's just no way around that. And that's just a limitation of the way that I have it set up. If I wanted to, I could instead control the visibility with expressions based on the value of this controller. You just tie it to the X value and use an if-else statement. But in reality, I'm probably never going to need him to be facing directly at the camera. And even if he is, this isn't that much of a deal breaker to me. In most scenarios, I'm guessing he's going to be looking off to one side or the other at least a little bit. Okay, so all of that is working great. Let me close all of this up and now turn on the hair top. Okay, so that can probably follow the hairline just like the ears do. So I'm just gonna grab that and parent it to the hair base control and see what happens. That's not bad. Now it's definitely flat. It doesn't look like the hair is rotating much. So maybe I want to add in some keyframes on the path as well. This is actually a really cool feature of controllers. It doesn't have to just be these values with numbers. It can also be paths. So let me convert this to a shape layer. And I'll get rid of the original copy. And then open this contents up and find the path. Add a keyframe and make sure I'm on frame 10. So that's my neutral state. And then we'll go to the left. And I want to see what the left side how far over that turns, what that would look like. So something like this. From here, I can now modify the path. So maybe this comes in a little bit and it straightens out a bit. Maybe this comes over this direction, and this chunk of hair, which would kind of be a little bit closer to the camera, just gets a little bit larger, a little bit more clumped or smushed together, I guess, and looks something more like that, okay? And then we'll move over to the right pose, and we'll go forward to 20 frames, and maybe I'll do the same thing in a little bit of the opposite direction. So bring this in just a little bit so it's not quite sticking out so far, and maybe make it a little more squished. And I'm just going to scrub through this so I can kind of see what that shape is going to be. I don't think this point right here should move up so much as it just moves inwards. I just kind of want to compress that in. And maybe I'll do the same with this point just a little bit. I don't want to modify it too much. Something like that though. Okay, so let's now tie that path to the same x-axis. Connect to properties. And there we go. And from here, I could modify the path however I want. So let's say that when it moves this way, I don't like how much this lower part dips in, or maybe this part needs to be a little bit modified. I can't actually do that right now. I can't modify this path because it's tied to an expression now. But if I just twirl this down and unlink the expression, I can modify the path. So I'll go to the correct keyframe, make whatever modifications I want to make, and then re-enable that expression. And there you go. So it's really easy to modify your values after you've tied them to the controller. I think that looks pretty convincing. So we've got our complete head turn now from left and right. And I think that amount of range is actually working really great with this design. Next up is moving the head up and down. So let's zero this position out and go to our 10th frame, and then just start adding in all the keyframes that we need on the Y position property. So I'm just going to close all of these up and find the facial features, and we'll start there again. So P on the keyboard to bring up the position, set a keyframe on the Y, and then we'll go back to the first frame. Now, it made sense that you map the left keyframe to the left side, the right keyframe to the right side. On the Y-axis, you map the left keyframe to the top and the right keyframe to the bottom. That's how you can think about it. So with the Y-axis of this controller at a value of a -100, right there you see, we want this head to be looking upwards. So with the facial features, I'm just going to re-enable that null, and I will move it up. So I'm not sure how far up I'll be able to push this, maybe -30. And then I'll grab the hair base control, open that up, and I'll move that up as well. I don't think I'm going to be able to push this all the way up to -30. That's quite a bit. So maybe I'll move it down to say -20 instead. I want those ears to follow that hairline again, so I'm going to grab both ears, press P on the keyboard, make sure I set that 0 position on the Y, and then go back and move them up -20. Oh, and I forgot to set a keyframe on that Y position in the hair base control. So let me do that for this, change it back down to 0. And now we can see how that is moving between those two keyframes. Very nice. Okay, and then we'll go to the third pose and go down 20 pixels for each ear and the hair base. And move the face down, was it 30 pixels? Yeah, change that to +30. And that's quite a bit of range for that as well. Now, the head does look a little bit strange, and the ears are actually going off of the head here because it's not moving at all. I think for this character design, it makes sense to have it a little more symmetrical left and right, but up and down, you can see it's much more egg-shaped. So I think I need to modify the shape of the head as well. So I'm going to create shapes from this layer, and I'll just leave the head there for now just in case I need it, but I'll go into the path. On frame 10, I'll set a keyframe for that path, and then back it up. This would be the up position. And I think the chin might narrow a little bit. So let me switch to my pen tool, hold down Option or Alt, and just redraw this so that it's a little bit more narrow. And it might also move up just a little bit. So let me do that as well and see what it looks like going between those two poses. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Okay, then we'll go to the third pose and kind of do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. So I want to grab that point one more time, pull it down, and then narrow it out a little bit again. So Option or Alt while holding the pen tool and just narrow it ever so slightly. It doesn't have to be a ton, but there we go. Obviously, the neck is not there, so we don't have the rest of the body to benefit from that, but I think that's looking pretty good. The only issue I see is the ears on this lower position, so I need to fix that with the head shape. So let me grab that path one more time, and maybe I'll pull these handles down a little bit so that it lines up here. And I'll do something pretty similar on the opposite side just to keep it symmetrical. And it looks like just a hair of that ear is still poking through, so let me modify this a little bit more. Okay, and maybe I'll pull his chin down just a little bit more on this lower pose. Kind of looking at the mouth to see where that is and basing the chin's position on that. I think that's good. I just want to widen the chin a little bit on this first pose. I think I made it a little bit too thin. Let me pull this handle out on each direction. Okay, now that looks like that. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So now I can grab that path position and I can change my connector from the x-axis to the y-axis. And I can also grab the Y position of the facial features of the hair base and both ears and connect to properties. Now, when I grab this handle and move it up and down, the head is going to move with it. And if I move it left and right, it's also going to move with it. So now both axes of this controller are controlling this head. We have a very wide range of motion left and right and a decent range of motion up and down. And I'd say that the head turn is pretty much finished. One thing that I'm noticing now is that the actual artwork, if we take a look here, on the nose, it has this split in the path when it's turned to the side. And that's actually something I could do pretty easily using this connector. So let me just convert this to a shape layer. And I know it already has expressions on it, but After Effects preserves all the keyframes, all the parenting, all the expressions. So that's fine. And I can delete the original Illustrator layer. And what I want to do is take a look at the shape of the nose and split it open when the head is turned all the way to the side. So I'm going to open this up, go into the contents, and find that group. And here we have the path. So what I want to do is just add a trim paths and then pull back the end just a little bit to see where it splits. So right there is the first vertex. That's where it's basing this 0 and 100% on. But I want it to be over here on this point right here. So I'm going to right click on it and go to Mask and Shape Path and say Set First Vertex. Now the end is going to be shifted off of that point instead. So I want to make this gap the same distance or pretty close to it. So I back that up 10%, so maybe I'll go 10% on the start. That might be a little bit too much. So let's say 8 and 92. And now we've got that gap in the side. And I can tie these two values to this controller the same way that I did any other property. So this is my far left pose. I'm going to go to the center and turn this down to 0 at the start and 100 at the end. And that way it's now closed up again. And then on the right side, I'll just copy these two keyframes and paste them over. And I realize that gap is on the wrong side, but we can use the offset property to just swap that around. So let me add an offset keyframe here at the center pose, move back to the left and add another keyframe, and then go to the right and just basically rotate this 180 degrees. So now the gap is on the opposite side, and maybe move it down a little bit so it's on the lower half. And I'm going to toggle these to be hold keyframes so that they behave the exact same way as the ears with the opacity. All right, let's tie these to the x-axis. Connect to properties and see what happens. So when I move this to the right, that gap closes up. Perfect. And when I move it to the left, or the character's left, it opens up again and it doesn't swap until right there. So really what I need to do is change this value to be the same as this one. So 169. I'll double click this and say 169. And at that point, that is where I want it to flip. When the gap is completely closed, where you won't notice that rotation of the offset, but then it opens up on that side. So that actually works out really nice. Now, I don't necessarily want it to open up when it's still this close to the center front-facing view. So what I'll do is just copy these two neutral value keyframes where the controller's in the center, back up maybe 2 keyframes and paste, and then go forward 2 frames and paste. And that way, all of these keyframes are zeros. So anything between the 0 value and there is going to stay completely closed. So that gap just doesn't open up until the head is turned a little bit further. And if I grab these keyframes and push them out a little bit more, then that gap's just going to stay closed even longer. So this is, again, how you can use more keyframes to kind of control what happens with this controller when it's at certain positions. I'm going to move these out even a little bit further. And there you go. I think that's working out really great. Okay, so the head turn is done. Let's move on to the individual controls of things like the eyes and the eyebrows using some more connectors. So I need to generate another connector for, let's start with the eyebrows. And you could do this a lot of different ways. It all depends on how much control you really want. I want to be able to move the eyebrows up and down, but I also want to be able to rotate them. Now you've seen that you can modify the paths and tie those to controllers too. So if you want to change the shape of the eyebrows, you absolutely could do that and just use the paths property as well. Really, all I want to be able to do is grab one of the eyebrows, move it up and down, and then rotate it like this. And I think I'll be able to get enough expression out of that for this character design, but yours might be different. And I could do this with just one-dimensional sliders. So I have one slider that moves the right eyebrow up and down, and one slider that moves the left eyebrow up and down, and then I could maybe use some angle controllers for the rotation. But I'm actually going to do something a little bit more advanced, just using another 2D connector. So I'm going to generate another one right now, and I'll move this over to the side and rename these eyebrows. And I guess it would make more sense to call this head turn rather than head control. So I'm just going to rename that real quick. But what I want to be able to do is use the y-axis of this controller to move the eyebrows up and down, and the x-axis to rotate the eyebrows in and out. So let's start with the up and down movement. I'll grab both eyebrows, and actually I want to tie them to a single null control. So let me grab that new null object, and I'll rename this eyebrows, kind of position it in the middle of them. And again, I'm just going to be a little bit obsessive with this and just change the size of it so that it kind of fits around the eyebrows, and that way I can identify it a little bit easier. Okay, so it should be right about there, and then parent these two eyebrows to it. And I need to also make sure that I parent the eyebrows to the facial features, because that was driving the two eyebrows. Okay, so I'll open up the position of the eyebrows and separate the dimensions. Make sure to zero out that position, and then set a keyframe on frame 10 for the Y position. That's the neutral value. I'll go to the first frame and move these up. Remember, the first frame is the top of the controller, so I'm going to back these up as far as I want them to go, maybe negative 15 pixels. I'll go forward to frame 20 and change this to 15 pixels. That looks about perfect. It comes right down to the pupils. And then I'll tie these to this controller. So I've got to go back into my connector, select that new controller and say pick master property. Make sure that I'm on the y-axis, and then grab that Y position and connect to the property. So that is now going to control the up and down movement. Great, I'm going to disable the eyebrows null so I don't see it anymore. And now I want to tie the rotation of each individual eyebrow to the x-axis. So let's change this to x and set rotation keyframes at the neutral value. Go to the left, and this is where I think I'll have them kind of rotate outwards. So he looks a little bit concerned maybe, and I'll go, let's say negative 20 degrees. So it has a lot of range. And then we'll go to the third pose and go in the opposite direction. So negative 30 and 30. And now he looks a little bit more angry. So with those selected, I will now connect to properties, remembering that's the x-axis. And now I can move this left and right to change his expression, as well as up and down. So I can make him look a little bit sad or surprised or angry or evil. I'm getting a lot of range out of this two-dimensional control. And I think for this particular character design, that's plenty. I don't really need to have individual controls for each eyebrow. Now that I got that working, let's add another controller, a two-dimensional controller for the eyes. I'm gonna move that down as well. So let's get that over here. And I'll rename this eyes. Then I'll find the left and right eye and do basically the same thing. I need to make a new null. I'll rename it eye control or eyes control and put it right in the middle of those two eyes and resize it. Adjust this anchor point again. Doesn't need to be perfect, but just a little bit more organized like this. And get that centered up, roughly. Okay, and then I'm gonna parent that to the facial features and parent the eyes to that null and zero out that null. All right, so with the position separated, I'll set my 0 position on the X and Y, and I'll go to the left, and we'll start with the X. This is gonna move them over, let's say -20 pixels. That's quite a bit, maybe -15 would be better. And then we'll go over to the 3rd position and say 15. And then we'll probably give the same distance on the Y position as well. So we'll go -15 and 15. And that's actually probably way too much. So let's just back all these values up to 10 each. The eyes probably don't need to be able to travel quite so far. Yeah, that's a little bit better. And now I'll select the eye controller, go into connector and say pick master property. Grab the X position and connect to properties. Then I'll switch to the Y, grab the Y position, connect to properties, and now this is gonna move those eyes around. Great. Okay, so I'll turn off that null, set that back down to 0, 0. Make sure that the head turn is still working. Yep, that's great. So I could push this head over, have him looking over further, have him look up, have him look surprised, concerned, sad, a little bit angry. This is where it's starting to get a lot of fun because you can really play around with the expression on the character's head and really just pose it however you want. All right, let's get these values back down to 0. And again, the amount of control that you need depends on your character and what you're planning on doing with them. But let's quickly just add in some blink control. So I'm gonna grab both of these eyes and bring up the scale. And I wanna be able to just unlink the X and Y and have them scaled down a little bit to have that blink. And in this case, I only have the 2 poses. I'm gonna use a 1-dimensional slider, and it just needs to be able to travel from basically -100 to 100. And I basically want it to be blinking when it's at one end of the slider and completely open when it's in the opposite direction. So I only need 2 keyframes on this particular control. So I'm gonna set the first keyframe at 100, and I'll go to the last keyframe and just scale it down to the point that I want them to be blinked. So something like that, okay? Then I'll generate my controller, which will just be a 1-dimensional slider, and I'll grab it and move it down below the eyes, which I think was this one, yep. And I don't need it to be this wide either. So I'm going to go into the slider controls and just change the size down to say 20. Okay, so now I don't have to travel this very far to get it to go from blink to fully opened. And I'll rename this blink, grab those scale properties and connect them to that controller. So now when it's all the way to the left, they're open. When it's all the way to the right, they're closed. So I want this to be at a position of -10. Since my slider is 20 pixels wide, I want it -10 to be on the far left and completely open. If you wanted individual blink controls for each eye, you would just need 2 sliders instead. And that way you can make him wink with either eye or have them both blink together. Okay, the last thing I want to rig up is the mouth shapes. So let me collapse all of my layers so I can focus in on these. And we're going to do this with a new method using a 1-dimensional slider. So these are all of my mouth shapes, and I'm just gonna change their color to, let's say, yellow, just so I can easily identify them. But they're all in the right position, and they're all attached to that facial features, so they're gonna move with the head turn the way that they should. But I wanna be able to easily select each individual mouth using a slider. So I'm gonna generate another 2D slider, and I'll call this mouth shapes. And I'm gonna make this slider really wide, so probably up to 500. maybe even further, because I have a lot of mouth shapes. And the way this is going to work is I travel this slider along it, and it's just going to swap between each mouth. This is actually really easy to set up. All I have to do is select these layers in the order I want them to show up, which it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to start with rest because I want that to be the first mouth shape, and then just shift click on the rest of them. And instead of saying connect to properties, I'm going to say connect to opacities. And watch what happens when I do this. It's going to add a bunch of keyframes to all of the opacities of these layers, and then tie all of them with expressions to this slider so that based on what the value of this slider is, it's going to swap between all of those. It turns all the others layers down to 0 and one of them to 100%. So if I move it all the way to the left, I get my resting mouth position. And if I move it all the way to the right, we're going to get that final TH position. So it's going in the order that I selected the layers in. So I can now easily go between any one of these poses and just hold keyframes on the actual controller to swap between them and do the lip syncing. Those are all the controls that I'm going to build into this head rig. All that's left is labeling things so that it's easy to see. Now, I'm not going to make you sit here and watch me. I'm just going to cut to when it's finished. And there you go. I have just labeled everything so it's easy to see. I've lined up all of these mouth-shaped sounds on the slider so I can just easily move this to whichever one that I need. And I've also done some parenting, so the blinks controller now moves with the eyes. I also made sure to enable all of the text layers as guide layers so they don't show up when they render. By default, the controllers do that automatically. But you can literally position these however you want. If you wanted the mouth shapes to be vertical instead of horizontal, you could do that. Whatever makes the most sense for your workspace, however you like to work. You can also customize the colors. So if I were to select any one of these and go into the handle, I can change the colors. So maybe I want these colors to reflect the design. I could select each one of these, change the handle to being this orange. And then maybe that's a little bit easier to see on top of the transparency. It's totally up to you how you want to do it. Another thing I didn't really point out is that you can change the size of the actual slider. So if you wanted to adjust how big this box is, you can, and it doesn't affect any of the values. It just gives you a bigger surface to be working with. So if I wanted to, I can make the head turn bigger and shift these two controllers out so this is a little more prominent, just so it has some more emphasis. It's very customizable. If you want to change the stroke thickness, you will have to go into the controller background shape layer because that's tied to an expression that keeps it at 1 pixel. But if I just disable that expression, I could change this to whatever I want. So if I want it a little bit thicker, that's totally doable. From here, I just need to swap out that composition for the head layer in my body rig. So let me unshy these layers, find that head, and duplicate it. And then I'll just bring this head rig over, hold down Option or Alt to replace. And there we go, we've got the head. I'm going to call this head rig. Turn off the original head, and that's linked up exactly the same way, so all of my other controls are still going to work. Now, I can't control the head rig in this comp because all of the controls are in the pre-comp, but I can actually transfer these controls out of this rig and into the main rig if I wanted to. And to do that, I'll just go to this rig, I'll find the layer that has the controls in it, the head rig, and then go over to my Create Controllers tab and click on Extract Controllers. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to click on the More Options button so you can see that we actually have 2 different options here. We can tie these new controllers using expressions or using master properties. The benefit of master properties is that we can have one head rig comp and then use that in multiple other comps without needing duplicates of it. Whereas if I were to use expressions, the controllers that I bring into this comp are going to drive the controllers in this pre-comp no matter what. There's no going back. So I'm actually going to switch this to using master properties and then click extract. Duik does a whole bunch of magic, but it brings all those controllers in. Unfortunately, it can't bring those text layers in because that's something I generated, but I can now move these around however I want. So I'm just going to parent all of them to this head turn controller background real quick. So I'm going to grab all the other controller backgrounds, except for the blink because that's already parented, and parent those to that head turn background. Now this is parented to the head rig because that's where it came from, but I don't want them to move around with the head. So I'm just gonna move them up here, and I'm going to unparent that master controller background. So they stay up here even if I were to modify the head. But from here I can grab this controller and move it over, And there you go, his head is turned. Now you may or may not want your head rig controls in the same comp as your body rig. It might be easier for you to just keep all this contained into one head rig comp. That's just a preference. You can do whatever you want. And honestly, extracting these controllers uses a ton of expressions and does slow the rig down even further. So more often than not, I am controlling my head just within the head comp. So the last thing that I really want to do is just clean up all of my layers because I only want to be able to see what controls the head, which are really these handles here. So I'm going to select everything and then deselect the controller layers, which you can easily identify with this C and then the vertical bar here. Just deselect each one of these by holding down Command or Control and clicking on them. Everything else can be shied, so I'm going to toggle my switches and modes and turn on the shy switch. And then I'm also going to lock all of those layers so I can't accidentally grab them, and then just shy everything. And I'm left with just these layers that control the head rig. And it's much easier for me to focus in on what actually makes things move. And with that, my head rig is complete. All right, I realize that was a lot to take in. If you made it through the entire tutorial, congratulations, thanks for watching. I hope that you can appreciate just how complex head rigs can actually be. And to be honest, I'm kind of surprised how much range I was able to squeeze out of this design. It actually worked out fairly well. But like you saw, you can really fine tune it to whatever you want. And maybe your character doesn't need that much range. Maybe you just need some subtle movement to be able to go from this kind of further turned 3/4 pose to more of a front facing 3/4 pose. And then you can just really dial in exactly what you want with these connectors. They're extremely powerful. Now, if you use Duik on a regular basis like me, I just want to strongly encourage you to check out Nicholas Dufresne, who makes Duik. Check out his Patreon. Consider becoming a patron for him and supporting him in all of his efforts to make Duik better. He's constantly working on it and making it better with new features. Even now, you may be using a version that looks different than mine because over time it has been added to and things are being updated. So consider donating to it and supporting it. It's always going to be free no matter what, but I just really want to encourage you to donate if you're able to. And a really easy way to be able to donate to the development of Duik and these other tools is to just put in a fee when you're working with clients that are using this script. When you're doing character animation or anything where you're using Duik, just add in a fee. The client doesn't need to know about it, just a fee that you're aware of so that you know you can donate that from the income that you're making from your clients to Nicholas and just help support the rest of the development of Duik. And finally, if you're interested in learning more on how to rig with Duik, check out my Jumpstart tutorial on Duik Bassel to get you up and running with it. But if you want even more detail, I also built a Skillshare class called Character Rigging with Duik Bassel, and I show you how to make this entire character rig as well as 3 other characters. And I try to do my best to really show you the ins and outs of how to build custom rigs using Duik Bassel. That's all for this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.